In the winter skies of 1943, a new silhouette appeared over Europe that made German pilots smirk with confidence. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately nicknamed the Jug by American pilots for its resemblance to a milk jug, looked nothing like a fighter aircraft should. It was massive, weighing over 7 tons when fully loaded, with a fuselage so wide that veteran Luftwaffe pilots joked it was easier to hit than a barn door. Compared to the sleek, nimble Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf Fw 190s that had ruled European skies, the Thunderbolt seemed like a flying mistake, a lumbering giant that had no business tangling with the refined killing machines of the Third Reich. German intelligence officers studied reconnaissance photos and dismissed it as another example of American industrial excess over aeronautical finesse. In the ready rooms and mess halls from France to Poland, Luftwaffe pilots raised their glasses and laughed at the prospect of facing this ungainly beast. They had no idea that this aircraft would become their worst nightmare, that those 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns jutting from its wings would rain down a storm of lead so devastating that the very mention of Thunderbolt would eventually make experienced German pilots check their six with genuine fear. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt began not in the romantic tradition of fighter design, where form followed function in elegant curves and purposeful lines, but in the stark reality of industrial pragmatism and engineering compromise. Alexander Kartveli, the brilliant Georgian-American designer working for Republic Aviation, had been tasked with creating a fighter that could do something no other American aircraft had yet accomplished: escort heavy bombers deep into the heart of Nazi Germany and return home safely. The challenge was monumental. European theater demanded range, altitude performance, firepower, and survivability in measures that seemed mutually exclusive. Every engineer knew that adding fuel meant adding weight, that increasing armament meant sacrificing speed, that boosting engine power meant expanding the aircraft's profile. Kartveli's solution was audacious in its rejection of conventional wisdom. Instead of trying to build a nimble dogfighter in the European tradition, he would create a flying tank, an aircraft so robust, so heavily armed, and so powerful that it could simply overwhelm its opposition through sheer force. The heart of the Thunderbolt was the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radial engine, a masterpiece of American engineering that generated an astounding 2,000 horsepower. This engine was so large that the fuselage had to be built around it, creating that distinctive bulbous profile that would become both the aircraft's trademark and the source of so much German derision. But what the critics failed to understand was that this engine, when coupled with a sophisticated turbocharger system, gave the P-47 performance characteristics that defied its ungainly appearance. The turbocharger, mounted in the rear fuselage and connected to the engine through an elaborate system of ducting, allowed the Thunderbolt to maintain full power at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. At 25,000 feet, where the thin atmosphere turned most aircraft into sluggish gliders, the P-47 was just hitting its stride, capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour and climb rates that shocked pilots accustomed to the performance degradation that came with altitude. The true genius of Kartveli's design lay not in any single component but in how everything worked together as a system optimized for a specific mission profile. The massive engine required a massive propeller, which in turn necessitated long landing gear to provide ground clearance. These long gear legs, rather than being a liability, gave the aircraft excellent visibility on the ground and during takeoff and landing. The deep fuselage provided space for fuel tanks that gave the P-47 a combat radius that, when fitted with external drop tanks, eventually extended to over 800 miles. This meant American bombers suddenly had a guardian angel that could stay with them all the way to Berlin and back, fundamentally changing the strategic bombing campaign that was slowly grinding Nazi Germany into dust. The armament was where American design philosophy diverged most dramatically from European practice. Where German and British fighters typically carried 2 or 4 guns firing a mix of machine gun and cannon rounds, the P-47 bristled with 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Each gun was fed by a belt carrying between 250 and 400 rounds, depending on the position and model. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, they spat out approximately 100 rounds per second, creating a cone of destruction that could saw through enemy aircraft like a chainsaw through balsa wood. The 50 caliber round was a peculiarly American solution to aerial combat, larger and more powerful than the rifle caliber machine guns used by most nations but smaller than the 20mm cannons favored by European designers. The 50 caliber offered a sweet spot of hitting power, velocity, and ammunition capacity that made it devastatingly effective against both air and ground targets. American ordnance engineers had developed several types of 50 caliber ammunition, each designed for specific purposes. Ball ammunition provided solid penetration for general use. Armor-piercing rounds used hardened cores to punch through enemy armor plate and engine blocks. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds combined penetration with a small incendiary charge that ignited fuel and hydraulic fluid. Tracer rounds left a visible path through the air, allowing pilots to walk their fire onto target. In practice, most P-47 pilots loaded their ammunition belts with a mix of these rounds, typically every fourth or fifth round being a tracer, creating a light show of death that arced through the sky toward enemy aircraft. The psychological effect of seeing 8 streams of tracers converging on your position was as debilitating as the physical impact of the rounds themselves. The first P-47s arrived in England in late 1942, assigned to the 56 Fighter Group based at Kingscliff in Northamptonshire. The American pilots who would fly these machines were a mix of fresh-faced volunteers straight from training and a handful of veterans who had cut their teeth flying other types. Their reception of the Thunderbolt was mixed at best. Pilots accustomed to the lighter P-40 Warhawk or the graceful P-38 Lightning looked at the massive P-47 and wondered if Republic had accidentally shipped them a medium bomber instead of a fighter. The cockpit sat high above the ground, requiring a small ladder to access. The aircraft's bulk made it feel more like climbing into a truck than strapping on a fighter plane. Initial taxi tests revealed steering that felt heavy and imprecise compared to lighter aircraft. Takeoff required what seemed like miles of runway. Heavily loaded aircraft reluctant to break free of the Earth's grip. But once airborne, the P-47 began to reveal its true nature. The climb rate was impressive, the controls surprisingly responsive once up to speed, and the feeling of sitting behind that massive radial engine with 850s ready to fire gave pilots a sense of confidence that was impossible to quantify but very real nonetheless. The aircraft felt solid in a way that lighter fighters did not, as if it could absorb punishment and keep flying. This impression would prove accurate beyond anyone's initial expectations. The P-47 could take damage that would have sent other fighters spiraling to Earth and still bring its pilot home. There were documented cases of Thunderbolts returning to base with cylinders shot off their engines, with wings perforated by cannon fire, with control surfaces half shot away, yet still flying and controllable. The tactical situation facing American forces in early 1943 was desperate in ways that official histories sometimes gloss over. The 8th Air Force was attempting to prove that strategic daylight bombing could work, that American bombers flying in tight formation and bristling with defensive machine guns could fight their way to targets deep in Germany, destroy them, and return home without unacceptable losses. The theory looked good on paper. The reality was a bloodbath. German fighters, initially surprised by the appearance of American heavy bombers over occupied Europe, had quickly adapted their tactics. They discovered that the bombers' defensive firepower, while formidable, had gaps. Head-on attacks, particularly from slightly above, offered German pilots a brief window to fire before breaking away, and they exploited this ruthlessly. B-17s and B-24s fell from the sky in shocking numbers, trailing smoke and fire, sometimes breaking apart under the stress of combat damage and violent evasive maneuvers, spilling their crews into the freezing air at 20,000 feet. The existing American fighters couldn't solve the problem. The P-38 Lightning had the range but suffered from severe engine problems in the cold European climate, particularly with its turbocharged Allison engines. The oil in the engines would congeal in the extreme cold of high altitude, and the complex counter-rotating propellers were maintenance nightmares that left too many aircraft grounded. The P-51 Mustang, which would later become legendary, was still in its infancy, and early versions with Allison engines lacked the high-altitude performance necessary for bomber escort. The RAF Spitfire, while a superb fighter, was designed for point defense of Britain and lacked the range to escort bombers deep into Germany. This meant that American bombers were on their own once they crossed into German-controlled airspace, and the Luftwaffe knew it. German fighter tactics had evolved to exploit this vulnerability ruthlessly. Luftwaffe commanders would track incoming bomber formations using an extensive network of radar stations and observer posts stretching across occupied Europe. They would vector their fighters to intercept points ahead of the bomber stream, then mass their forces for overwhelming attacks. Groups of 20, 30, or even 50 German fighters would assemble at altitude, then dive through the bomber formations in carefully orchestrated waves. The lead fighters would break up the tight defensive formations, forcing individual bombers to fall behind or lose altitude. Follow-up waves would pick off these stragglers, and the final attacks would target damaged bombers struggling to keep up. It was methodical, brutal, and devastatingly effective. Into this maelstrom came the P-47 Thunderbolt in the spring of 1943. The early missions were learning experiences paid for in blood and wreckage. American pilots had trained for fighter combat in the clear skies over the southwestern United States, where visibility stretched for dozens of miles and combat was a relatively clean affair of position, speed, and gunnery. The skies over Europe were something else entirely. Weather systems rolled in from the Atlantic with stunning speed, turning clear blue sky into murky gray soup in minutes. German fighters appeared out of cloud layers without warning, fired their devastating salvos, and disappeared back into the clouds before American gunners could respond effectively. The sheer speed of jet-age combat, where closing speeds could exceed 700 miles per hour, gave pilots only seconds to identify targets, line up shots, and fire before flashing past each other in opposite directions. The first major engagement involving P-47s in significant numbers came on April 15, 1943, when the 8th Air Force sent bombers to attack industrial targets in Germany and the 4th Fighter Group provided escort in their new Thunderbolts. The German reaction was immediate and fierce. Messerschmitt Bf 109s of Jägerschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite units, swept in from above and ahead, clearly intending to brush aside the American escorts before savaging the bombers. The German pilots, many of them veterans with dozens of kills to their credit, expected to make short work of what they considered an inferior opponent flying an aircraft that looked like it belonged in a circus rather than aerial combat. What happened next shocked both sides. The German fighters dove on the P-47s, expecting to use their superior maneuverability in a turning fight to quickly gain advantage. But the American pilots, following their training and understanding their aircraft's strengths, refused to play that game. Instead of turning to meet the German attack, they dove away, using the action of April 15th set the pattern for what would follow. German pilots quickly learned that their previous tactics, which had worked so well against RAF fighters and earlier American types, were not effective against the Thunderbolt. You could not outdive it. The P-47 was the fastest diving fighter in operational service anywhere in the world. You could not outrun it at high altitude. The turbocharger gave it performance that matched or exceeded German fighters above 20,000 feet. You could not survive its gunfire. The 850s delivered more kinetic energy on target than entire flights of lighter-armed fighters. The only advantage the German fighters retained was maneuverability, particularly at lower speeds and altitudes. But that advantage only mattered if you could force the P-47 into a turning fight, and American pilots, growing wise to their aircraft's capabilities, increasingly refused to oblige. As spring turned to summer in 1943, more P-47 groups became operational and the learning curve sharpened on both sides. American tactics evolved to maximize the Thunderbolt's strengths. Flights would maintain altitude and speed, using their height advantage to dictate the terms of engagement. When German fighters appeared, P-47 pilots would assess the situation carefully. If they held the advantage of position and numbers, they would attack, diving down with tremendous speed and firing devastating bursts before pulling back up to altitude. If the situation looked unfavorable, they would simply refuse combat, using their superior dive speed to disengage and reposition. This flexibility, the ability to choose when and where to fight, represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power in European skies. German fighter pilots found themselves in an impossible tactical situation. Their primary mission was to destroy American bombers, but they could not reach those bombers without first dealing with the escorts. Yet engaging the escorts exposing themselves to an aircraft specifically designed to win the high-altitude, high-speed fight. Some German units attempted to avoid the P-47s entirely, trying to slip past the escorts to get at the bombers. This sometimes worked when the escort force was small or poorly positioned, but as more Thunderbolt groups became operational and American tactical coordination improved, the gaps in fighter coverage grew increasingly rare. Other German units tried to use superior numbers to overwhelm local American forces, massing fighters for concentrated attacks. This led to some of the largest air battles in history, with hundreds of aircraft swirling through the sky in a three-dimensional chess game played at 400 miles per hour, where the penalty for mistakes was death. One such massive engagement occurred on July 28, 1943, during an American raid on industrial targets in Kassel. The Luftwaffe, determined to exact a heavy toll on the attackers, assembled a defending force of over 300 fighters, including some of their best units and most experienced pilots. The Americans countered with a similarly massive force, including multiple groups of P-47s tasked with providing escort. The resulting battle sprawled across hundreds of square miles of sky, from 25,000 feet down to the deck. P-47s dove and climbed, their engines roaring with power, their guns hammering out streams of 50 caliber destruction. German fighters twisted and turned, trying desperately to get onto the tails of the American escorts or to break through to the bombers beyond. Contrails painted white lines across the blue sky, marking the paths of fighting aircraft. Parachutes blossomed like flowers as pilots abandoned their stricken machines. Aircraft fell burning toward the earth below, trailing smoke and flame. The sound was unlike anything the civilians on the ground had ever heard. A constant thunder of aero engines running at full power mixed with the sharp rattle of machine gun fire and the deeper boom of cannon. When the battle finally broke up after nearly an hour of continuous combat, both sides were bloodied, but the strategic picture was clear. The American bombers had reached their targets and dropped their loads, damaging German industrial capacity. The escorts had performed their mission, keeping enough German fighters off the bombers to allow the attack to succeed. German pilots returned to their bases with tales of the Thunderbolt's prowess that were almost unbelievable to those who hadn't experienced it themselves. They spoke of American fighters that seemed impossible to kill, that absorbed hits that should have been fatal and kept on fighting. They described the terrifying experience of having 850s trained on your aircraft, the way the tracers seemed to reach out across impossible distances, the sound of rounds hammering into your fuselage and wings like a metal hailstorm. They talked about American pilots who fought with a methodical precision that suggested excellent training and iron discipline, who didn't panic when outnumbered but instead worked together as coordinated teams, covering each other and exploiting any opening with ruthless efficiency. The reputation of the Thunderbolt spread through the Luftwaffe like wildfire. In ready rooms and officers' messes from Norway to Italy, German pilots traded stories and warnings. They developed a healthy respect for the big American fighter that bordered on fear. Intelligence officers compiled reports on American tactics and P-47 performance characteristics, trying to find some weakness that could be exploited. They discovered that while the Thunderbolt was indeed less maneuverable than German fighters at low speeds, it more than made up for this with advantages in other areas. They noted that American pilots seemed increasingly confident and aggressive, pressing home attacks even when outnumbered. They observed that the P-47's ruggedness meant that even damaged aircraft often made it home, denying the Luftwaffe the confirmation kills they desperately needed to claim in their struggle to maintain the illusion of air superiority. The technical aspects of the 50 caliber machine gun deserves deeper examination because it was central to the P-47's effectiveness. The Browning M2 was a development of the legendary John Browning's designs, refined and improved over decades of use. It fired a cartridge that was substantially more powerful than the standard rifle caliber rounds used in many other machine guns, with a bullet weight of approximately 700 grains and a muzzle velocity of around 2,800 feet per second. This combination delivered tremendous kinetic energy on target, roughly twice that of a 30 caliber machine gun. The round was also ballistically efficient, maintaining its velocity and energy over long distances better than smaller calibers. This meant that a P-47 pilot could open fire at ranges of 600 yards or more and still expect hits to be effective, giving them a standoff capability that was invaluable in fast-moving aerial combat. The gun itself was a marvel of mechanical engineering, using a short recoil operation with a rising breech block that made it reliable and relatively simple to maintain. The firing rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute per gun was high enough to put significant rounds on target during a typical 2 or 3 second burst, but not so high as to exhaust ammunition too quickly. The mounting system in the P-47's wings was sophisticated, with each gun supported by a substantial framework that absorbed recoil forces and kept the weapon aligned. The ammunition feed system used disintegrating link belts that allowed for mixed ammunition loading and prevented empty cases from cluttering the wing structure. Heaters wrapped around critical components prevented the guns from freezing at high altitude, where temperatures routinely dropped to 40 or 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. American armorers became extremely skilled at maintaining these weapons systems. Each gun would be inspected and tested regularly, with worn parts replaced and timing adjusted to ensure all 8 guns fired in proper synchronization. The preferred method was to bore sight the guns so that all 8 streams converged at a point between 200 and 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. This created a cone of fire that was relatively dispersed at long range but concentrated into a tight pattern at the convergence point. A target at that optimal range would be struck by all 8 streams simultaneously, receiving the full weight of the P-47's firepower in an area only a few feet across. The effect was like being hit by a giant's fist, overwhelming in its violence and nearly always fatal. Pilots developed almost a sixth sense for the right moment to fire. Ammunition was limited, with the total load being just over 3,000 rounds divided among 8 guns. This gave somewhere between 30 and 40 seconds of total firing time if all guns were held down continuously. In practice, pilots fired in short bursts, typically 1 to 3 seconds, conserving ammunition while maximizing the chances of scoring hits. The sound of the guns firing was distinctive, a deep hammering roar that pilots felt as much as heard, transmitted through the airframe into their bodies. The aircraft would shudder slightly from the recoil, and spent cartridge cases would stream from ejection ports. In the wing's lower surface, glittering in the sunlight as they fell away. The smell of burnt powder would seep into the cockpit, an acrid scent that became forever associated with aerial combat for those who experienced it. The psychological dimension of aerial combat in World War II is often underappreciated in technical discussions of aircraft performance and tactics. Flying a single-seat fighter into combat was a lonely, terrifying experience regardless of which side you were on. The stakes were absolute. You won or you died. There was no middle ground. The speeds and altitudes involved meant that errors were instantly punished. Spatial disorientation could send you spiraling into the ground before you realized what was happening. Mechanical failures at 25,000 feet over enemy territory meant bailing out into capture at best, death at worst. The cold was intense, with outside air temperatures well below 0 even as the cockpit heaters struggled to keep pilots from freezing. The noise was constant and overwhelming, making communication difficult and adding to the general sense of chaos. For German pilots in particular, the arrival of the P-47 in strength marked a psychological turning point. They had entered the war confident in their aircraft, their training, and their tactics. The early victories over Poland, France, and initially Russia had reinforced this confidence. Even the Battle of Britain, which Germany lost, had not fundamentally shaken the Luftwaffe's belief in its qualitative superiority. German pilots knew that individual British fighter pilots were skilled and brave, but they also knew that German fighters and tactics were at least equal to anything the RAF could field. The arrival of American forces had initially seemed more of the same, another opponent to be mastered through skill and experience. The Thunderbolt changed that calculation. Here was an aircraft that was superior in many respects to anything the Luftwaffe could field, flown by pilots who were rapidly gaining experience and confidence, backed by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than the Germans could inflict them. The strategic implications became clear as 1943 progressed. Before the P-47 and other long-range escorts became available in numbers, the German strategy of defending against daylight bombing had been viable. The Luftwaffe could concentrate its fighters along the bombers' expected route, inflict heavy casualties, and force the Americans to either abandon daylight operations or accept unsustainable losses. The escort fighters changed everything. Now German fighters had to fight their way through an increasingly effective screen just to get at the bombers, and doing so cost them dearly. The attrition worked both ways, but the Americans could replace lost aircraft and pilots far more easily than Germany could. Every experienced Luftwaffe pilot shot down represented an irreplaceable loss of skill and knowledge. Every P-47 lost could be replaced within weeks, often with an improved model incorporating lessons learned from combat. The ground crews who maintained these aircraft were unsung heroes of the air war. Keeping a P-47 operational was a constant challenge. The massive R-2800 engine required careful attention, with 18 cylinders that could develop problems individually. The turbocharger system, with its complex ducting and high-temperature components, needed regular inspection and maintenance. The 8 machine guns had to be cleaned, tested, and properly loaded after every mission. The hydraulic systems that operated the landing gear and flaps were complex and prone to leaks. The radios, while more reliable than earlier models, still required frequent adjustment and repair. All of this work had to be performed in all weather, often at night or in the early morning hours, so that aircraft would be ready for the next day's mission. Ground crews developed a fierce pride in their aircraft and pilots, working themselves to exhaustion to keep their birds flying. The winter of 1943 to 1944 saw the air war over Europe reach new levels of intensity. The American strategic bombing campaign was gathering momentum, with larger and more frequent raids striking deeper into Germany. The Luftwaffe responded by pulling fighter units from other theaters, concentrating its defensive force in an attempt to make daylight bombing too costly to sustain. The result was aerial combat on a scale never seen before, with battles involving hundreds of aircraft becoming routine. In this crucible, the P-47 proved its worth again and again. Its ability to absorb damage became legendary, with aircraft returning from missions with battle damage that seemed impossible to survive. There were cases of P-47s landing with entire cylinders shot off their engines, with wings perforated by cannon fire showing daylight through dozens of holes, with tail sections nearly severed by enemy fire, yet the aircraft flew and brought their pilots home. One particular incident that became famous throughout the 8th Air Force involved a pilot named Robert Johnson. On June 26, 1943, Johnson was escorting bombers when his P-47 was hit by cannon fire from a Focke-Wulf 190. The German pilot, displaying both skill and determination, positioned himself behind Johnson's aircraft and proceeded to systematically shoot it to pieces. Cannon shells tore through the fuselage, smashed into the engine, shattered the canopy, and wounded Johnson. The structural damage was catastrophic, with large sections of the skin torn away and control surfaces damaged. By any reasonable standard, the aircraft should have broken apart or become unflyable. Johnson, wounded and unable to bail out because his canopy was jammed, had no choice but to try to fly the crippled Thunderbolt home. Against all odds, the P-47 responded to his controls. The engine, despite having cylinders destroyed and oil streaming from multiple leaks, continued to run. Johnson nursed the aircraft across the English Channel and made it back to his base, where the ground crew stood in stunned silence at the damage the aircraft had survived. The incident became a testament to the P-47's incredible ruggedness and was used in training films to show new pilots what their aircraft could endure. The German pilots' initial derision turned to grudging respect and eventually to something approaching dread as they faced the Thunderbolt month after month. The psychological wear of knowing that you were flying an aircraft inferior in key respects to your opponent, that any mistake would likely be fatal, that even if you performed perfectly you might still lose, took a heavy toll. German fighter pilot losses mounted steadily through 1943 and into 1944. The experienced pilots who had formed the backbone of the Luftwaffe fighter force were being killed or wounded at a rate that far exceeded the ability of the training system to replace them. New pilots were rushed to the front with inadequate preparation, often with fewer than 100 flight hours in type. These inexperienced pilots were lambs to the slaughter when they faced veteran American P-47 pilots who had learned their trade in the harsh school of aerial combat over occupied Europe. The tactical evolution of P-47 operations continued throughout the war. Early missions had focused primarily on close escort of bomber formations, with fighters sticking close to their charges and only engaging enemy fighters that directly threatened them. This proved suboptimal, as it allowed German fighters to dictate the terms of engagement and often resulted in running battles where the escorts were too busy defending themselves to adequately protect the bombers. As experience grew and confidence increased, American tactical doctrine evolved toward a more aggressive posture. Fighter groups began to split their forces, with some elements maintaining close escort while others ranged ahead and to the sides of the bomber stream, seeking to intercept German fighters before they could attack the bombers. This freed the escorts to use their aircraft's strengths more effectively and put the Germans on the defensive. The next evolution came with the introduction of fighter sweeps and patrols independent of bomber operations. P-47s would take off ahead of bomber formations and sweep the intended route, attacking German fighters on the ground or climbing to intercept, catching them at their most vulnerable. These missions required careful planning and flawless navigation, as getting lost over enemy territory with limited fuel was a quick route to becoming a prisoner of war. The psychological effect on the Luftwaffe was significant. German pilots were no longer safe even when taking off from their own bases. They had to scan the skies constantly for American fighters, never knowing when a flight of Thunderbolts might appear and catch them in a vulnerable position. The initiative had passed to the Americans, and the Germans found themselves increasingly reacting to American actions rather than executing their own plans. P-47's capabilities expanded beyond pure air-to-air combat as the war progressed. The same qualities that made it effective as a fighter, the rugged construction, powerful engine, and heavy armament, made it equally effective in the ground attack role. The 850 caliber machine guns that could tear apart enemy fighters proved equally devastating against ground targets. Locomotives, trucks, tanks, armored cars, supply dumps, bridges, all were vulnerable to strafing runs by P-47s. The aircraft could carry bombs and rockets in addition to its internal guns, expanding its strike capabilities even further. By 1944, many P-47 groups were conducting as many ground attack missions as air superiority missions, ranging across France and Germany, shooting up anything that moved. German ground forces learned to fear the sound of a Thunderbolt's engine, knowing that it likely meant death from above was imminent. The ground attack missions were in some ways more dangerous than air-to-air combat. Flying at low level over enemy territory meant exposure to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. German flak gunners became increasingly skilled at leading fast-moving targets, and the volume of fire they could put up was intense. Unlike aerial combat, where you could maneuver and fight back, ground attack meant flying through a storm of exploding shells and tracer fire while trying to identify and hit small targets on the ground. The P-47's armor and ruggedness proved invaluable here as well. The aircraft had armor plating protecting the pilot from below and behind, and the radial engine, with its cylinders arranged in a circle around the crankshaft, could lose several cylinders to battle damage and continue running on the rest. There were numerous instances of P-47s returning from ground attack missions with their oil coolers shot away, hydraulic lines severed, wings perforated with flak damage, yet still flying. One of the most famous ground attack missions involving P-47s occurred during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When the weather finally cleared after days of fog and snow that had grounded Allied aircraft, Thunderbolt groups launched en masse against German armored columns pushing through the Ardennes. The Germans, who had been making good progress while Allied air power was grounded, suddenly found themselves exposed to devastating aerial attack. P-47s descended from the winter sky like avenging angels, their guns hammering, their bombs and rockets turning German tanks and trucks into burning wrecks. The psychological impact on German troops, who had enjoyed air superiority during the opening days of the offensive, was crushing. American ground forces, who had been desperately holding against superior numbers, felt an almost religious gratitude for the appearance of friendly aircraft. The ability of the P-47 to operate in marginal weather, when other aircraft were grounded, proved critical in this and many other battles. Stories of individual pilots and their exploits in P-47s could fill volumes. There was Francis Gabreski, who became the top American ace in Europe flying Thunderbolts, with 28 confirmed victories. There was Robert Johnson, whose damaged aircraft was mentioned earlier, who scored 27 kills. There was Hubert Zemke, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group and turned it into one of the most effective units in the 8th Air Force. Each of these men and hundreds of others like them had their own stories of desperate combats, of victories snatched from the jaws of defeat, of comrades lost and missions completed against all odds. Their experiences formed a collective narrative of the air war over Europe that was written in contrails and cannon fire, in victory rolls over friendly airfields, and in wreaths of flowers on memorial walls listing the names of those who never came home. The German perspective on the P-47 evolved from dismissive contempt to wary respect to genuine fear over the course of about 18 months. Intelligence reports from late 1943 and early 1944 show Luftwaffe analysts trying to come to grips with the implications of American escort fighters in general and the P-47 in particular. They recognized that the strategic situation had shifted fundamentally. The daylight bombing campaign, which had seemed on the verge of collapse in the summer of 1943 due to unsustainable losses, had instead grown stronger. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang alongside the P-47 in late 1943 and early 1944 made the situation even worse from the German perspective. Now there were two types of American escort fighters, both capable of reaching any target in Germany, both formidable in combat. The P-51 had superior range and high-altitude performance, while the P-47 had superior firepower and ruggedness. Together they formed a one-two punch that the depleted and increasingly poorly trained Luftwaffe fighter force could not counter. German aircraft designers attempted to develop responses to the Allied fighter threat. The Focke-Wulf Fw was designed as a high-altitude interceptor specifically to counter the American escorts. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter offered revolutionary performance that theoretically made it untouchable by piston-engine fighters. But these advanced designs arrived too late and in too few numbers to make a strategic difference. The Tu-52 was an excellent aircraft, but barely 100 were built before the war ended. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied fighter but was vulnerable during takeoff and landing, and P-47 pilots learned to patrol near known jet bases and catch the jets at their most vulnerable. Moreover, chronic fuel shortages and the collapse of the German training program meant that even when advanced aircraft were available, there were not enough skilled pilots to fly them effectively.